today and explain the format today, as well as how this fits in with a seminar project that that this is a part of. So Professor Darcy Toit is currently emeritus professor in the Department of Mercantile and Labor Law, UWC, and the author of several books and articles. His research on workplace democratization, employment equity, and more recently has focused on the digital platform work. And so we're looking forward to him sharing his views with us on the rights of workers in a platform economy. And then Carl Frey is Oxford Professor Martin Citi Fellow and co-director of the Oxford Martin Program on Technology and Employment at Oxford University, and author of this wonderful book, The Technology Trap, Capital, Labor and Power in the Digital Age, which provides an historical account of technological change, including its most recent phase and its implications for workers, employment, and wages. I also want to introduce Emeritus Professor Eddie Webster, who's taught everyone in South Africa that I know, at least, industrial sociology for wonks, and who heads up the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University, will act as our discussant today, as well as Professor Kathy Albertine, who holds the Sachi Chair for Inequality Studies and is a colleague with me in the law school. The Southern Center for Inequality Studies and the chair are our partners in the MI in a seminar series which has focused this year on inequality. Today's event is a part of this series. There's a certain automation discourse which is slowly entering the South African lexicon. It's long overdue because we avoid dealing with this kind of disruptive technological change at our peril. But it also enters with a sunny disposition as a techno-utopian proposition, which appears to me, at any rate, to avoid all the serious questions about the implications for our society and for public policy. Surely we should be asking the kind of questions we're going to be asking today about the impact of digitalization or the impact it will have in the absence of public measures on the distribution of income and wealth, on the fiscus, what implications it has for education, and of course, which is our specific focus today, what implications it has for the world of work and of workers, which is the focus of today's discussion. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to call on Professor du Toit to give us his presentation. Have we lost Darcy?
I think we're starting with Carl Frey.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
Okay.
My mistake.
So thank you first of all very much for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. It would have obviously been even nicer to be with you in South Africa, My wife and I had actually planned to go there back in February before this pandemic came along, but hopefully there will be others opportunities thereafter. I'm going to be talking about my book, The Technology Trap, which came out with Princeton University Press last year. And the book basically asks the question, should we feel reassured if the future of automation looks like the history of automation? Because as many of you will have noticed, the discourse is in general becoming more and more polarized, and the automation debate is no exception to that. So on the one hand, you do have scholars and pundits who believe that this time is entirely different. Artificial intelligence is going to be so pervasive that they will be able to do everything, and the consequence of that will be mass unemployment. And on the other hand, you tend to have mostly economists who point to history and say, look, we've been having this debate for a long time, and we had 2 centuries of mechanization and automation. And that turned out quite well. We're much richer today than we were back then. And that is certainly true, but as I argue in the book, averages conceal a great deal of variation. And there have been actually very different episodes of technological change in the past as well, which depends to a large extent on whether technological change has been more of the enabling type, which creates new tasks for labor, or whether technological change has been more of the replacing type, in that it replaces workers from existing jobs, tasks, and industries. So you can think of, for example, automatic elevators, which displaced elevator operators, had a very different impact on the labor market than, let's say, the telescope, which didn't replace any workers, but allowed us to do new and previously inconceivable things. And a second key point in the book, and I'm going to go through the main points of the book first, in case I forget anything later on the presentation, but I hope it sort of helps provide a framework in terms of how I think about this. So during periods where technological change has been more of the replacing kind, we also seen more economic polarization and social unrest. And quite frequently in history also, we've seen that the losers to technological change in the short run have often tried to restrict the implementation of automation technologies. Most of you will have heard of the Luddites and the Luddite riots in 18th century Britain, but they were actually part of a much longer wave of riots that swept across continental Europe, Britain, and even China. And one point of the book as well is to illustrate that resistance to technologies that threaten to replace people's skills have been more or less the historical norm rather than the exception. And obviously, to what extent those losers are likely to succeed in blocking the introduction of new technologies has to do with the distribution of political power in society. So just to give you one example, about a century ago, the streets in Oxford and in London and in most places in Europe, or most cities, were lit by lamplighters who carried ladders and torches to ignite gas lamps every evening. And when electric street lights came along, obviously this occupation gradually disappeared. And in Brussels, in Belgium in particular, the lamplighters weren't very happy about this. So they first went on strike when the switch to electricity was announced when they went on strike, the city employed a new group of lamplighters who were soon attacked by the striking lamplighters. The entire situation escalated with the lamplighters raiding police headquarters, and the army was sent in to resolve the situation. So these lamplighters didn't have much political power, their efforts weren't successful, but they did try it. And there's a tendency to think of such resistance as being backward and Luddite. And obviously, if you take a very long run view on automation, that may seem ridiculous because people, even at the lower end of the income distribution in countries that have industrialized, are a lot better off on all sorts of metrics today than they were when the first industrial revolution, or the first sort of wave of mechanization, if you like, took off in Britain around 1750. But if we actually zoom in on the first industrial revolution and look at the experience of peoples who lived through it, we also find a very different picture, which is that wages were stagnant or possibly even falling at the lower end of the income distribution during the first 7 decades of industrialization. So even as the British economy took off and output grew by roughly 50%, that didn't trickle down into the pockets of most ordinary people. And a puzzle to economists and economic historians have been, why would people have voluntarily agreed to participate in the industrialization process if it reduced their utility? And the simple answer to that is that they didn't. They petitioned to Parliament to block the introduction of machines. They rioted against the mechanized factory. And how did the British government respond? Well, on a number of occasions, it actually responded by sending out the army. So the army that Wellington took against Napoleon in 1808 in the Peninsular War was actually smaller than the army that was sent out against the Luddites. So I think it's important to keep in mind that mechanization, when it is of the replacing, or when technological change is of the replacing type and threaten worker skills, resistance can be the rational response. And it is absolutely true that factories created new jobs, but it also primarily created jobs for an entirely different breed of worker. Many of these spinning machines were actually designed to be tended by children, and as middle income artisan jobs disappeared, or domestic industry disappeared with mechanization, it was a rational decision for many actually to resist it. Now, the point I'm trying to make in this book is certainly not that, history is going to repeat itself or is repeating itself all over again. But if we look at long-run trends in inequality, I think it's noteworthy that in frontier economies like Britain and the United States, levels of income inequality, and I'm looking at the Gini coefficient here, has been approaching levels not seen since the first industrial revolution. And I'm absolutely clear about that technology is not the only factor that has been driving this pattern. Unionization, minimum wage, capital market liberalization, all of these factors are related to the income distribution as well, but it has been one of the key features. And obviously the technologies are very different this time around. So this time we are looking at the computerization of industry. We're not talking about steam engines and spinning machines. And computerization has been going on for a long time, but it's actually only in the 1980s that computers become sufficiently cheap to have really an impact on the labor market. And they're having an impact on the labor market in two ways. On the one hand, they are making it possible for companies in advanced economies to offshore production and coordinate production at distance to places like China. And they're also allowing firms increasingly to automate away a lot of routine repetitive tasks that were previously done in factories. And if we look at wage patterns in the United States, what we do see is that for men and women at essentially any level of educational attainment, wages are rising up until the first oil price shock in the 1970s. They are then basically stagnating for all. And beginning in the 1980s, we see this divergence happening, where it's particularly the wages of prime-age men with no more than a high school degree who would have had more abundant job opportunities in factories. Their wages have actually been falling in the United States for almost 4 consecutive decades now. So it's not just a question of rising inequality. There are certain groups in the labor market whose earnings capacity has been diminished by these trends. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this has been driven both by automation and offshoring and globalization. And if you look at the geography of this, what you find is that Chinese imports, for example, have primarily affected labor markets in the American South. Automation and robots, on the other hand, have primarily affected places in the Rust Belt. And they have had very similar consequences for local labor markets. And they also led to a lot of bad social consequences in those places. So we see, for example, that where manufacturing jobs have disappeared, whether due to globalization or automation, we see increases in crime, we see deteriorating public services, we're seeing declining marriage rates, we're seeing also what Anna Case and Angus Seaton have called the deaths of despair, increases in substance abuse and suicide, and so on. And I think if you want to understand why 3 key swing states, being Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which had opted for the Democratic candidate every election since 1992, all of a sudden ended up being won by the Republican candidate in 2016. Automation is part of that story. And we even see, as we're speaking now, the Rust Belt being won back by the Democratic candidate, but not with the margins that anybody would have expected. And it's pretty clear that those are still very contested places today. And we've already seen this backlash against globalization. We haven't seen the same sort of backlash against automation. But most people now actually work in non-traded sectors of the economy. They are less shielded to future globalization. The rise of China has already happened. It's not going to happen twice. But they are actually less shielded from future automation, because as the potential scope of automation expands with artificial intelligence and machine learning, automation is no longer just going to be confined to these routine rule-based activities that can easily be specified in computer code and therefore readily automated, as machines are increasingly capable of learning themselves through trial and error and tapping into the data trails we leave behind. The potential scope of automation is expanding as well into things like medical diagnostics, to machine translation, to driving a car, and so on. And it's absolutely true that these technologies are far from perfect today. We don't have autonomous vehicles on the road. Google Translate is not perfect. But I think it's important to keep in mind that every sort of revolution in new technology starts with imperfect technology. So the steam engines that powered much of the Industrial Revolution, for example, The early ones were merely used to drain coal mines, and even that they didn't do particularly well. It took some time for them to become energy efficient, and in similar fashion, it's going to require also a lot of incremental innovation to make artificial intelligence sufficiently data efficient. But I think few people are in doubt that this is something that is currently underway. Back in 2013, we did a study with some collaborators at the engineering science department here in Oxford, trying to estimate what this means for future automation. And what we find in that study is that it's by no means just confined to production jobs and manufacturing. It spans across a very wide range of occupations and industries, whether it's retail, whether it's logistics, whether it's transportation, back office work, construction, and so on and so forth. And we also find some rather surprising results. So one occupation we estimated back then susceptible to automation is the jobs of fashion models. And a lot of people used to tease us for this. Now we actually see what's called generative adversarial networks generating new models and new faces through thousands of pictures. So the fashion models you see on this slide here, for example, they don't exist, but they do have their own Instagram accounts. Now, the book was written well before the pandemic, and I can't sort of end without saying anything about that. And here I think it's noteworthy that even though automation has happened for a long time, it's often happened in spurts. And some recent analysis that took our automation assessments, which I mentioned earlier, and looked at how employment has fared in jobs at risk and at low risk, suggests that those at risk disappeared more rapidly and have not yet rebounded to the same extent. Now, obviously, that may be because they are less likely to be done remotely, or it may be that they are heavily concentrated to sort of service sectors that have suffered more from the pandemic. But even when they look within those different categories, they do find that there is a difference between those at risk and those at low risk. And if we go back to and look at the Great Recession, for example, what we do see there is that routine rule-based activities disappeared very rapidly during the recession, along with a lot of other jobs, I should say. But the difference with these routine rule-based jobs is that they never really came back. So businesses that decided to employ automation technologies rather than rehiring workers, it seems. And part of the story may also be that sort of increasingly cash-strapped consumers during economic downturns tend to shift towards cheaper goods and services, which are produced using more automation technology. So when people go and eat at McDonald's, rather than going to a normal restaurant, for example, they are increasing the level of automation in the economy. Now, even before the pandemic, we see that there are some examples of resistance to automation technologies. So these are workers at the harbor in Los Angeles going on strike because of the introduction of autonomous cargo trucks. A Pew Research survey suggested that the majority of Americans actually favor limits on machines beyond hazardous jobs. And we do actually have some service evidence for some countries before and after the pandemic, which in most cases suggests that people are more anxious about automation now than they were before the pandemic. And that shouldn't really be a surprise, because if you lose your job during an economic downturn, you have fewer outside options than if you lose your job when the economy is booming. And it's probably not a coincidence that we saw more resistance to mechanization during the first industrial revolution, particularly during the years of the continental blockade, which caused disruption to the British economy. We saw more anxiety about automation during the Great Depression, during 3 post-Korean War recessions, and it's likely that we are going to see more anxiety again as a result of this pandemic. So I'd like to end here and end with a quote from Leontief, who once suggested that if horses could have joined the Democratic Party and voted, what happened on the farms might have turned out differently. They might have used their political voice to resist the mechanization of agriculture. Now, I don't know how that is going to play out, but I think that it is a risk that needs to be taken seriously. In the book, I outline several proposals how to help people adjust and how to make the distribution of the gains from automation more widely shared. And hopefully we'll have some chance to discuss that as well later on. So thank you for your attention.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl. Hello?
Hello, we here.
Oh, okay. Sorry, he just disappeared. Hello?
Hi.
Can you hear me, Darcy?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I can hear you.
Please go ahead.
Now, I want to share my screen, and I'm not sure. Let's see. Okay. Are you seeing my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
You're seeing my slideshow.
Yes.
Yeah.
You are, okay, because I'm seeing it on one monitor but not on the other one. But that must be in order then. Well, thank you, Dr. Frey. That was a very, very interesting talk from my point of view. It sets the scene that law is needing to engage with. It touches on many important areas of law, which are also very controversial and have been for a long time, such as the law of dismissal. When can you dismiss workers because their jobs are redundant? When is that fair to do so? What must employers do to try and save jobs? All those are legal questions which keep on taking new dimensions as we speak. However, I'm going to be limiting myself, given that I have 20 minutes, to an aspect suggested by Eddie, which I also think happens to be quite central to the whole problem of labor rights in the digital economy. And I'm going to be taking Uber as an example because it illustrates so many of the problems, even though platform work and work in the digital economy takes many, many different forms. But nevertheless, one can't deal with them all in one go. One size does not fit all, and Uber does, I think, take us to many of the central problems. So let me try and move that on. Right. So platform work has an upside and a downside. The upside is it's part of a developing sector of the economy. More and more people are finding work, especially people who can't find steady jobs, but they can find work as delivery drivers and the like. This, however, comes up against a very particular business model which most platforms use, and that is the workers who work for them are not employees with all the rights of employees, job security, and so on. They are classified as independent contractors, and that is part of their conditions of service. The contract that they're given to sign only has that option. If they don't accept that, then they don't get the job. And the effect, therefore, is that workers do not have any of the rights that all of us who are or were in employment have, namely protection against dismissal, maximum hours, paid leave, and all the rest of it. They are there really at the will of the platform or of the person using their labor, and they can be got rid of at a moment's notice. It also means that they've got no built-in rights to organize collective bargaining, nothing at all. They really are one small individual against a big corporation such as Uber. They don't stand a chance when it comes to bargaining. And the other aspect is the so-called sharing economy, and it has a somewhat ironical meaning to it. It means really the worker is the one who shares what they have. In theory, the worker owns the car with which to transport passengers for Uber to derive their income from, and the worker must pay for the petrol, the worker must pay for the maintenance of the car, the insurance, all the rest of it. And so too in other branches of the platform economy, the worker shares the tools of the trade, so to speak, and the platform reaps the profit. From a legal point of view, just by the way, the fact that platform workers are treated in this way is, in my view and that of many others, in clear breach of the South African Constitution, because the Constitution guarantees fair labour practices to every worker, not simply to employees, but to every worker. And every worker has the right to organise, engage in collective bargaining and so on. Platform workers have none of those rights. And likewise, the International Labour Organization conventions to which South Africa is a party, they also require those fundamental rights to be extended to all workers without distinction. Now, this is, of course, as I'm sure many people are aware, this is highly controversial, and the fact that workers are classified as independent contractors has been under attack. It has been challenged, and it is simply, it is an obvious challenge because platform workers such as Uber drivers, but also many others, they resemble employees to such a large extent. The law is supposed to look at substance, not at technicalities. And in substance, I would say, and many others would say, an Uber driver really, genuinely, is an employee of Uber, and describing that worker as an independent contractor is a legal fiction or a sham. This becomes fairly clear if we look at the test for what is employment, who is an employee. Now, the bullets that you see on screen are taken from a certain section of South Africa's Labour Relations Act, but most countries have similar tests for who is an employee and who is an independent contractor. It's an important distinction because a genuine independent contractor, a person who runs his or her own business, operates in a different level from an employee and doesn't need employment rights because they objectively are not employed. They are working for themselves from day to day for different customers every day, every hour. But Uber drivers and similar platform workers work for the same platform day in, day out, week in, work out. And these are some of the criteria of who is an employee. And incidentally, it's not a checklist. What the courts do in South Africa and in many other countries is they look at what are considered to be the typical features of employment, and then they see on balance this particular working relationship, to what extent does it correspond to the model of employment, and to what extent does it depart from that. Now, but the most important of those criteria is the control or direction. Dr. Frey referred to the Industrial Revolution, and that's where all this started, when employers or entrepreneurs had the option of whether to hire in skills or whether to bring workers under their own factory roofs. And they chose the factory model because it gave them control over the workers minute by minute. And they got more out of the workers in that way. Now, being subject to the control or direction of the other person, that is one of the critical factors, the most critical perhaps. Another is that hours of work are under the control of the other person. And that link that you see there, I don't think it's live. I don't think I can click on it, but that's a report that came in yesterday from South Korea about a delivery driver who literally worked himself or was worked to death after 21 hours of non-stop work. He spoke to a friend, I think, on a phone and said that I can't take this any longer. And shortly after that, he died of exhaustion. Now, a simple thing that we take for granted, like maximum hours of work and rest periods, it does not apply in the platform economy. The hours of work are subject to the control of another person. And the question then is, that delivery driver, did that driver voluntarily, of his own free will, work himself to death? Or was there some kind of compulsion on him to clock up the necessary number of hours to gain the necessary income? And we don't know the full story. But in practice, workers, in theory, they can choose when they work, and many who are not under acute pressure do choose to work when it suits them. But for the vast majority, they have to work in order to have food and to be able to pay the rent and pay for the petrol and pay the maintenance for the car and pay the insurance and all the rest of it. The worker forms part of the employer's organization. Well, if we buy the story that Uber is nothing but a company that lets out an app which other people make use of quite independently of Uber, then they have no organization. But in reality, as we know, the European Court of Justice has said so, Uber is a transport business. They make their money out of people using the Uber app to get rides on Uber's terms and conditions, using a driver with whom Uber contracts to perform the service on their part. So I think in reality, an objective court would say that those drivers are part of Uber's organization. Then normally the courts also look at what's this, like a once-off transaction or an ongoing one, and said with platform workers, it is ongoing. In the vast majority of cases, that's where they get their living from. And they are therefore also economically dependent on the platform. That's another important characteristic of employment. The employee depends on the employer for her or his daily bread. And workers, platform workers, depend on the platforms for their work. One other feature of employment is that the employer provides the tools of the trade, the equipment that the worker uses. In the case of Uber, typically, the worker provides the car and all the rest of it, but Uber provides the app, without which nothing would happen. And so there the picture is mixed. And finally, the worker is not conducting an independent business. In other words, the worker is not genuinely an independent contractor. Now, Uber drivers who drive cars for Uber and possibly one other platform, unless you call driving a car running a business, which most people would not, that worker does not have a business of his or her own. That worker spends his or her life conducting Uber's business, which is deriving Uber's income from rides provided by that worker. So going through the checklist, as you can see, it's often not a straightforward answer. And based on that, as we'll see in a moment, the courts can arrive at different answers depending on the precise nature of the relationship. But nevertheless, I'm fairly confident if a South African court were to test an Uber driver in our law against the criteria of employment, the court would conclude that on balance, that driver is an employee. And that means then that the description of that worker as an independent contractor is actually fictitious. It is what the law calls disguised employment. and that is summed up in the following four features of, in the case of Uber, the workers are the ones who offer the service that Uber provides. If you or I want a ride and we use Uber, we don't think of, we are now going to go to Mr. Joe Bloggs, who is the name of the driver who will drive the car. We are transacting with Joe Bloggs. We don't know who Joe Bloggs is. We transact with Uber, and we pay Uber on terms and conditions determined by Uber, and Uber will then inform us, oh, by the way, your driver is Joe Bloggs. The terms and conditions are set by the platform. A genuine independent contractor, such as the electrician who comes to fix our lights, will tell us what their fee is, what their call-out fee is, all the rest of it. But Uber is the one that determines what we will pay and what the driver will get out of it. The driver has no say whatsoever. The control is very real. It's algorithmic for the most part. It takes many forms. Through the app, Uber can measure when the worker is online or not online. If the worker is not online often enough, Uber can start applying pressure on the worker to be online more often. And very importantly, through customer feedback, Uber can exercise quality control over the driver. And Uber can unilaterally terminate that worker's services by simply expelling the worker, kicking the worker out of the platform, as they do. And that is where the dismissal claims arise, when workers claim that Uber dismissed them, and Uber denies it and says, no, they were independent contractors. But when the courts look at all this, in certain cases, the courts conclude, yes, the worker was an employee, yes, the worker was dismissed. So the unilateral termination is another aspect of the disguised employment that is in fact a form of dismissal. So as I've mentioned, workers have taken Uber to court, and many other platforms like Deliveroo and Lyft and others have been taken to court. And the outcome has been very mixed across, from Spain to the United States, different states, United Kingdom, and France, many different countries. And one can't really generalize too much, because every country, the law is not quite the same. So whether the worker wins or loses will depend on what exactly the law says in those countries, and also what precisely are the terms and conditions under which Uber operates and which the worker operates. That will determine the conclusion that the court comes to. For example, in an UK case, Uber versus Hasler in the Court of Appeal, decided in 2018. There, the Court of Appeal decided the driver, they were workers, which is a subcategory of employee in English law, in UK law. And that was on the basis very much of UK law, because in the UK, in order to operate in London, Uber has to register as a transport providing company, in breach of his basic principle, claiming only to provide an app. But to be able to tap into the lucrative British market, they have to register as such. And that was an important factor why the court found that the drivers were employees of Uber. And in fact, there's one quote from that case that I like very much, from the judge of the Employment Appeal Tribunal, who said that the notion in Uber's case, as Uber claims, that each of the 30,000 Uber drivers in London conducts his or her own business, the judge said that idea is faintly ridiculous. And I would agree with that. Another case in which the workers also won was in California, the Dynamics operation, the Dynamics case, in which the court laid down a test for who is an employee. I'll come to that in the next slide in a moment. And that also went the workers' way. But in other cases, other judgments have gone the other way, and the courts found that the workers were in fact independent contractors based on the specifics of their relationships and what the law exactly says in those cases. For example, certain states of the USA, such as Florida, where the law more or less says that Uber drivers are independent contractors. Now, the test in the Dynamics case, the so-called ABC test, is now part of the California Labor Code. And if we translate that into ordinary language, it comes down to 3 criteria, which the court will apply 3 questions, namely, does the worker perform work on terms that are objectively determined by the platform? Or does the worker, him or herself, determine what they pay, what they charge the customer, what service they offer? Secondly, do those services, or does the work performed by the worker, is it part of a service offered by the platform? Now, if one accepts that Uber offers rides, then one would have to say that workers are offering a service offered by Uber. And thirdly, does the worker have an independent business in which the worker performs the same kind of work for other customers? Now, an independent business that doesn't simply mean that you spend time working for somebody. It means that a business is an entity which is more than that. Does the worker have such a business, and does that business serve other customers? And the closest that Uber drivers may come to this is that they may spend part of their time also being drivers for other platforms, but then legally speaking, I would simply say they are part-time employees of Uber and part-time employees of those other platforms. Now, however, in the last day, in fact today, it was in the press, as you may have also read, that Uber and Lyft have spent $200 million, I think, in California, running a campaign under California law to have a public ballot taken on changing the law. In this case, to amend the law in such a way that Uber drivers and delivery drivers will, whatever the labor code may say, will be classified as independent contractors, a kind of a plebiscite. And that Proposition 22, as it's called, that was then won by Uber and Lyft. And 58% of the people who voted that workers should be classified as independent contractors rather than employees. And that means that the gains made in the Dynamics case and previous judgments and the provisions of the labor code that I've just referred to are now null and void in the case of the drivers covered by this Proposition 22. And that is, of course, a setback. It is a thing to not be very happy about if one takes a human rights approach to the law. But it's not the end of the story, really, because in a way it's the beginning of the story. This is where Fair Work comes in. This is where many of us have come in for some time now. Many have argued that we shan't solve the problems of work in the platform economy or the digital economy by simply trying to transplant the rules of employment law as it has grown up in factories and shops and mines over the generations to this new, completely alien environment, simply because the rules don't really fit there. Organizational rules and rights are based on workplaces, on physical workplaces, buildings where hundreds, if not thousands, of workers congregate, where they perform similar tasks, where unions can walk in or meet them at the factory gate, can sign them up, can sit down with the boss, can negotiate wages across the board, and so on. Health and safety, the inspectors can move in, they can control the workplace, see what the ventilation is like, all the rest of it. So too with dismissal law, hours of work. It's all based on the idea of conventional work from 9 to 5, from 8 to 5, from 8 to 4, and so on. And the digital economy is simply so flexible and so fluid that those rules don't find much traction. Therefore, the argument is, by myself and many others, is that we need a custom-made paradigm that is based on the realities of work in the platform economy to replicate the protections that workers in the traditional economy have achieved over the generations, to replicate those rights in new and appropriate forms tailored to the conditions of the platform economy. It will mean amending laws, and there are many ideas on this already. We've done a lot of work has been done on this, but I won't try to go into detail, just to make the point that trying to have platform workers and other digital workers classified as employees is important in the case of disguised employment, but it will not reach all cases, and platforms can stay one jump ahead of the law by slightly amending the terms and conditions so that they move just beyond the paradigm of employment. And case law litigation means case by case by case, and there are millions of workers in the platform economy. One can't have millions of court cases. So what we really need is revisiting the basic legal rules and lawmaking institutions, and producing legal rules and protections which are suited to the needs of the platform economy. And just to conclude, I mean, one point that Dr. Frey touched on, namely his very interesting discussion of the first industrial revolution and the impact that had on the world of work. Well, in many ways, what I think is called for in the platform, in the digital economy, in the fourth industrial revolution, is a replication of what happened in the second industrial revolution and following that, namely from the 1880s onwards, when in the age of electricity and steam and so on, factories and offices and mines, when unionization happened and labor law began to evolve, driven by the organizational muscle of the unions. That lawmaking process, producing a labor law framework geared to the needs of those workers. We now need a similar process to happen in the context of the digital economy and the so-called fourth industrial revolution. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Darcy, for that very interesting presentation. Eddie, are you ready to take over?
Right. Okay. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Right. I'm Eddie Webster from the Southern Centre of Inequality Studies, and my focus research is around the impact of new technology on the future of work. Let me say first what a really wonderful session this has been with the historical perspective, but bringing it right up to the present of Carl Frey, and then the more concrete case study of Uber that Darcy has taken us through in some legal detail. Let me just, I mean, Frey suggested that we have we'd have a conversation. I find it quite unnerving to have a conversation when you can't really see people and engage with them and their sort of body language. But let me start with a comment on Carl's technology trap. I mean, I think that there's a widespread view, particularly in the media, that we're entering the age of the end of work, that we're going into a period of technological unemployment. And of course, this is driven by the whole idea of a fourth industrial revolution. Now, what I really liked about Carl's presentation is that he challenges that head on in a way. essentially, what he's arguing here is that if you take the long view, yes, technology is a disruptive force. People lose their jobs, but if you take the long view, over time, wages rise and the conditions of working people improves. I think that's quite a fundamentally important view of technology. Secondly, and I really find this distinction that was in his first slide quite fundamental. He draws a distinction between enabling technology, that is technology that improves productivity and creates new opportunities or new work. I guess computers can be seen as an example of that. So you have enabling technology versus replacing technology. I love the example of the lamplights, Carl. I mean, I'm not old enough to remember lamplights, but what I do remember is your other example, and that is lift operators, elevator operators. In Johannesburg in the 1960s, not all that long ago, the job of lift operator was reserved for white men. In terms of our job reservation, you had to operate a lift. You had to be a white male. Of course, this is long gone, but and of course, technology displaced that as well. It's now automatic. But I think it's a really important distinction you're making between enabling technology and replacing technology, because it's the replacing technology that takes away that job and de-skills. And then thirdly, I think what I found also very intriguing is the central point, I think, underlying your argument, and that is that there's deepening inequality through the new technology, but that it's generating an authoritarian, if you like, right-wing responses. And those slides you gave, the pictures there are about the Rust Belt and kind of key sources of Trump's support lying amongst that category of working people who've been displaced through relocation of manufacturing jobs to other parts of the world. I just wanted to raise three quick questions, if I may here. I mean, I think that you mentioned, but you didn't explore it rather suggestively, how to distribute the gains more fairly. If you could just maybe respond to that point. You know, clearly, you know, you're making an argument about increases in productivity, but how does one ensure that those gains are fairly, and maybe we can have more concrete. And the second point, it's a slight puzzle and a question mark. Why do you call it the technology trap? What is the trap? I was thinking, well, maybe it's these tech giants and so on. And but I maybe you could just expand on that point. And then thirdly, and this is a particular question, maybe a bit unfair here, but are there any differences, do you think, between the global north and the global south? I mean, we call ourselves the Southern Center, Carl, of Inequality Study, and by Southern we mean the global south, essentially the developing world. Is there anything that would make you argue that the kinds of propositions you're making and the historically would express themselves differently in a country like South Africa, or let's say for Africa, where you've got a large-scale informal economy, South Africa, large-scale long-term unemployment? I mean, one thing I am, and of course that's, it's our research area, so maybe it's a bit unfair on you, but one thing that emerges from preliminary research is that that it doesn't follow automatically or logically that automation is the way forward in Africa, because of problems of investment, of a limited infrastructure, particularly when you think of the digital economy. So in terms of cost calculation, introducing robots may not be, given existence of cheap labor, the most cost-effective way of going. So I'm just wondering if you would share some thoughts on that. And then with regard to Darcy, which Darcy's really fascinating account of the way in which these tech giants, and he focused on Uber, evade their legal responsibility. I think that I'm seeing Darcy as the central point, and I just pulled out through the concept of the independent contractor, and there are just 3 points that struck me in your presentation. The one is that there is an assumption in the business model of Uber that you own your own motor car, or you have an asset, and that asset's an unutilized capacity. From the research that I've done here, and this is not on Uber, but Uber Eats, food couriers in Johannesburg, is that nobody, or very, very few people, own their own bike. So, that assumption underlying the model, it doesn't fit. I mean, maybe this is a point about the global south rather than the global north. The second point you're making about the test of employment, I think it was a very powerful argument you made, and based up by these wonderful case studies from legal examples, that essentially these are employees because they are controlled and directed, and a whole lot of other examples of that. It's a form of disguised employment. You make quite convincingly. And then just the third point, which I really, you were basically suggesting that we need a new paradigm to understand this blurred relationship between employment and employee. They're neither one nor the other. And I think you've put your finger on the problem here, and that in fact we need to come up with a regulatory framework that responds to the specific needs and conditions of work that they experience. I just wanted to conclude with 2 or 3 points drawn from my own research. The first is what we found that the men, by the way, and they're almost entirely men as food couriers here in Johannesburg, are largely undocumented migrants, and I'm not quite sure what implications that has, because that's quite a fundamental problem in terms of your whole way of regulating them. A second point really is about Proposition 22 and the ballot in California that was announced yesterday, challenging the idea that Uber is and Lyft are examples of an employee relationship and endorsing the independent contractor. What you didn't mention, and I'd be quite intrigued by that, is we've had a similar case in South Africa where it was taken by I think it was the South African SATAW, Transport Workers Union, took initially to the CCMA and then and won it in the CCMA, and then lost it in the Labour Court on the grounds that Uber's head office is in the Netherlands and they're not South African employees. I'm just wondering, whether that's been taken forward or how you think it could be taken forward. And just one final question I wanted to address to both Carl and Darcy. It seems to me with the new technology and particularly the digital economy, it's now possible for men and women to work from home through remote work. And in a way, you mentioned, Carl, the shift from homework to the factory. I'm just wondering whether it's interesting, almost as if we're going full circle and people are going back to homework. I don't think that's a permanent solution, but I wonder what implications that, as a response, in a sense, homework and the new technology that makes it possible to do it remotely has for both your arguments. I think I'll leave it there for Rose, and maybe we can give our 2 speakers an opportunity to respond and then open it to the House.
Yes, that's perfect, Eddie. Carl?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah,
Indeed.
go ahead.
So there were a lot of questions in there. So let me start with the easy one, which is why is it called the technology trap? Because my publisher wanted the book to be called the technology trap. It's a simple answer. I wanted it to be called something else. But the technology trap in the book refers to a situation where you, in a sort of low wage equilibrium, you have, replacing technologies being introduced, them being resisted. If resistance succeed, you sort of stuck in that trap. So it refers to the situation where sort of the short-run pains from technology can preclude people from the long-run gains, if you like, and that's the technology trap in the book. With regard to the question, to what extent this applies to the global south, so I think there's also a lot of variation within the global south, and there's a lot of variation between advanced economies as well. And what I do in the book is I focus primarily on frontier economies. So Britain up until the second industrial revolution, the United States after that. The reason for that is that different countries took very different routes to industrialization. So even if you look at the first industrial revolution, you find quite different patterns in how the gains from industrialization were shared. So Britain was first to industrialize. It didn't have the benefit of having another country to learn from, and it didn't have the benefit to plan ahead the same way that Germany did, which invested a lot more in education, for example, from the very beginning. So I think frontier economies are different in a way that you can't draw upon the experience that well from other cases, or at least you're less able to do so. You can find historical parallels, but clearly every time is to some extent different. In addition to that, I would say if you're in a country where you don't have any manufacturing industry, you wouldn't worry too much about the automation of manufacturing industry. You would worry about its absence to begin with. So if you look at a country for India, like India, for example, it has had very little growth in the manufacturing sector, and there's also very few robots. So the fact that it's little manufacturing employment hasn't to do with robots, has to do with the fact that it hasn't really industrialized. If you look at China, for example, it has a lot of robots, but it's also seen a lot of employment growth in manufacturing industry. That said, though, if you look at the past 4 years, over 12 million manufacturing jobs have disappeared in China due to offshoring and automation. So obviously the elasticity of demand and things plays a role in this. The sort of outside options you have. If you have sort of better paid jobs in industry than in the countryside, then you're sort of moving into better paid jobs. The difference with the sort of hollowing out of the labor market we've seen now and sort of during the first industrial revolution is that people were pushed out of middle income jobs and often dropped down to jobs of lower pay. In many countries, those middle income jobs haven't really sort of been created yet. So that is certainly something that is different. With regard to sort of the policies and how to make this more inclusive, I think there's a tendency to think we have this big challenge and we need one big solution, and that is UBI. I argue against that in my book. I think there's a lot of things that may sound like minor proposals individually that can collectively make a big difference. So if you think about something like wage insurance, for example, so if you lose your job to import competition from China in the United States now, and you drop on down to job of lower pay, the government will cover some of those wage losses, but not for automation. So it doesn't really make sense to distinguish between import competition and automation. That way, wage insurance could be applied much more broadly. In addition to that, I think there's a sort of real challenge with regard to the clustering of new jobs in relatively skilled cities, and that driving up house prices in those prime locations, which in turn makes it harder for people on lower income to actually move and live when new jobs are being created. So there's a case for expanding housing supply in prime locations. There's also a case for investing in infrastructure to offset some of the job loss in manufacturing industry and the housing boom up until the Great Recession did to some extent sort of mask the disappearance of manufacturing jobs, and that was unmasked more after the recession. But there was also a case for investing in infrastructure to connect expanding and declining areas. So a lot of the bad social consequences of disappearing manufacturing jobs is highly sort of concentrated to a few places. So to give one example, which is close to my heart, where I grew up in southern Sweden, is Malmö, specialized in shipping. And when the shipyard closed down in the 1990s, the local economy suffered as a consequence. Along a decade later comes the bridge to Copenhagen, allows people to stay put in Malmö where housing is cheap, commute to Copenhagen where there's a greater abundance of well-paying jobs. Most people will spend what they earn locally in Malmö, which gave a boost to the local service economy there. And it's now one of the most dynamic labor markets in Europe. So, I mean, I think there's a package of policy, and I'm happy to discuss more that could really help, the transition on the one hand, but also to sort of compensate people on the lower end of the income distribution. Tax credits for low income households, for example, is an
Thanks, Carl. Eddie, a response?
No, does Carl have any thoughts on the question of the sort of remote work and the implications of that with the new technology?
Sorry, I forgot that part. So yeah, I do think actually that will have some consequences. First of all, as we've seen in the United Kingdom, there are a lot of in-person service type of jobs that are suffering, well, A, from the lockdown, but B, also if people work more remotely, you will see businesses like Pret, which sort of cut 3,000 jobs in the UK recently, are very much going to be affected by remote working. So people are going to spend less as a consequence of that, at least in sort of in-person type of services. And that is also affecting a lot of low-skilled jobs. We also see that it's mainly sort of relatively skilled jobs that can be done remotely. So in financial services, we estimate that roughly 80% of jobs can be done remotely. In leisure and hospitality, it's closer to 15%. So it's likely that that is exacerbating inequality. In terms of the geography of jobs, I'm not a believer in the death of the office and the end of cities and all of that. I think what we're going to see is that many jobs that are sort of centered on innovation, in those type of jobs, sporadic interactions are still very important. So in the sort of exploration phase, we still rely a lot on these sporadic interactions. But then when we want to execute a project, we are more happy to retire to our home, where we are more likely to be left in peace. But if a job then can be done entirely remotely, it can also be offshore. So it is possible that we will see actually some more offshoring of also service jobs. And that's what we will be left with in advanced economies, are more of these sort of exploratory innovation jobs, which tend to be highly clustered. So I think it's sort of, in a way, sort of a continuation on current trend.
Thanks, Carl. Eddie, can I go on?
Yeah, let's move to Darcy, I think.
Darcy?
Right. Thanks for those questions, Eddie. And I'll try and deal with the three which I think are most central. Yes, the sharing and the fact that most Uber drivers, certainly like Uber Eats, no doubt, and probably the same applies in other forms of delivery services. The vehicles are not owned by the workers, as they should be in theory, as they might be in some countries where there's a higher standard of living. They are owned by fleet owners. And the fleet owners then allows the worker to use that vehicle to be an Uber driver, and then the worker pays the fleet owner rental for using the vehicle, something like 3,000 Rand per, is it not per week or per month? I'm sorry, yeah. But anyway, the workers pay significant amounts for the use of the vehicle. And that's part of the calculation where the workers end up barely keeping head above water. Now, what this shows, I think, is, again, the divergence between theory and practice, the idea of workers using their own underutilized resources to earn some cash on the side, as opposed to workers working for fleet owners who contract with Uber and and act almost as labor brokers, if you like, getting those workers to generate Uber's revenue. Uber, in other words, is not fussy at all. They don't insist on a pure model of genuine independent contractors. They simply want bums on seats in cars to drive the cars and on their terms and generate income. And in South Africa, with a whole history of taxi operators and taxi fleets and so on, that I suppose was something that was waiting to happen, and it will be difficult to move beyond that. The second point, and here again I can entirely agree based on our own research, the fact that so many of the platform workers, including domestic platform workers, are undocumented migrants. Well, you also have that happening in Europe, although the European Union means that there are fewer undocumented workers, but you still have undocumented workers from Russia and elsewhere. And of course, in the United States, you have the workers from Latin America who are there as cheap labor, and as Eddie mentions, who therefore cannot make their presence known, keep a low profile, and therefore cannot stand up for their rights. So that is a huge problem when it comes to this new paradigm I'm talking about. And that again is why it is really a paradigm and not simply a case of tweaking the law here and there. It will mean, in my view, and that of others, revisiting immigration law. The African Union and South Africa and SADC have talked quite a lot in general terms, fairly glowing sounding things about single markets and opening up frontiers and disposing of visa duties and so on. But the one thing which is not being permitted is the free flow of labor. And we've seen in this country xenophobic attacks on migrants. We've seen the rise of the new right in various European countries, usually sparked by some kind of perceived threat to local livelihoods, and then exploited by bigots and demagogues and so on, right-wing parties, certain presidents of certain countries who will hopefully not be presidents for much longer, but all those things are part of the mix, and it will take serious interventions to make a significant change there. That is not to say that we are baffled by it. A huge amount of work has been done on this. Research has been done. There are many proposals for how to move forward. But I think what it will require, ultimately, the biggest requirement is political will. And political will, as we know, does not come easily. It is much the status quo, the way of least resistance is what normally prevails. But we do have those moments in history, like in this country, in the early 1990s, 1991, 92, 93, when we did see what was to me at the time the unthinkable happening. I, for one, could not imagine the peaceful dismantling of apartheid until it actually happened. And then it was perfectly clear why it was inevitable. But so too, sorry, I've muted myself. It will take, I think, a huge build-up of socio-economical and political forces to create a climate where policymakers and lawmakers will find it necessary to start making the kinds of changes to the legal environment which many forward-looking people have been arguing for a long time, including that seemingly sacrosanct barrier, namely preventing workers from other countries from entering. We simply need to understand that whether we like it or not, we are part of a bigger labor market. Migration is here to stay. Putting up barbed wire fences or building walls on Mexican boundary is not going to stop it. It'd be much, much more sensible to find ways to regulate it in a creative way, in a beneficial way. And there are many proposals for that. But the political will needs to be built up. On the point of the Uber case in South Africa, well, I know it rather well because I was the attorney of record for the workers in that case. In the CCMA, when it came to the hearing, we came in rather late when the case was about to be heard. And as Eddie says, we did win in the CCMA because the commissioner, a senior commissioner, and I see Laurie Warwick is here today, and Winnie Everett, a colleague, was the commissioner there, who took, in my view, an enlightened view of the reality of the employment relationship and applied that test, and was willing to find that the workers had the right of access to the CCMA because they were objectively employees. And that was overturned on quite technical grounds when it got to the Labour Court, not because so much because the Labour Court, it was Judge Andre van Niekerk, who also is a very focused judge, because he had made up his mind about the status of the workers. In fact, he expressly found that if and when this case is tried on its merits of what are these workers, it may well come to a different conclusion. But the question that was before the court was purely the one of jurisdiction, namely, did those workers make out a case that they had the right of access to the CCMA? And what it ultimately turned on was the fact that the only contracts that the workers entered into were with Uber BV in Amsterdam. So it was not the fact that Uber BV was in Amsterdam. The problem was that the workers' union had initially ended up being, to my mind, influenced to bring the claim of the workers against Uber Technology South Africa Pty Limited, because that is the company with the offices in Greenpoint, Cape Town, where the workers physically went to, and they ended up identifying that as being Uber that they brought their case against. But the claim, but their contracts were not with Uber South Africa. Their contracts were with Uber in Amsterdam, Uber BV in Amsterdam, which is the case for workers in Canada and elsewhere as well. And so the point that Judge van Niekerk made was, if and when a court has to decide whether the workers are employees of Uber BV in Amsterdam, it will be a different matter altogether. But that was not the question that was before the court. The question was simply, are they employees of Uber BV of Uber Technologies South Africa, and the court found it was not enough of a link between them and the and Uber South Africa, and that therefore Commissioner Everett, in the court's view, had gone too far in being willing to infer a real contractual connection between the workers and Uber South Africa. Now, and I must add as well that what always plays a part in cases of this nature is that courts and commissioners as well are quite sensitive to the fact that if they rule against one party, the other party is likely to take them to a higher court, and the higher court, and then they have to think, what principles will the higher court apply? And in my mind, again, had Judge van Niekerk decided otherwise, there was a very real prospect, looking at the track record of the Labour Appeal Court, that the Labour Appeal Court might well have applied a more cautious approach and not been willing to infer a contractual connection between the drivers and Uber South Africa. And so therefore the Labour Court, to avoid being overturned on appeal in the Labour Appeal Court, made that safer finding. And so it often goes until a matter gets to the Constitutional Court, because there the buck ends, and there finally the matters can be decided in the most fundamental way. But South Africa, we've not yet gone that far. In the UK, I believe that the Uber versus Asla matter is on its way from the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court, the former House of Lords, and there too the buck will stop.
Thank you, Darcy. We have gone on for some time, but some number of you, of our participants, are still with us. So I'm going to afford you an opportunity to put questions. I suggest you use the hand function if you wish to do so. Anyone? I see Kathy there.
Thanks, Feroz. Yeah, I have a general question. You know, when I listen to things around technology as a kind of epoch-changing event, if you like, I compare it to things like climate justice and climate change. And I wondered if there was any value, at least in some circumstances, of thinking about ideas of just transition, which we use in relation to climate change, and we use when we're thinking about moving from dirty energy to clean energy and dealing with mining in South Africa, and whether that was at all a possibility in some areas relating to technological change, where you could have a just transition out of a particular industry or an economic sector that was rapidly changing, to at least save the work and the livelihoods of people who are in that particular industry? Or is it something that really doesn't fit in this particular area?
Any response from our speakers?
I mean, it's a really good question, and clearly, I mean, highly relevant to climate change in particular, but also I think relevant more in general. I think if you look at some of the Asian economies, like Japan in particular, industrial policy played a very critical role in their industrialization, but also in the transition from certain industries to others. So when industry was stagnating, they often, forced mergers and forced industries to downside, and provided basically the kind of transition you're referring to. I think the hard part is transitioning into what. So I think governments in general hasn't been very good at sort of identifying and targeting sectors that are likely to grow in the future. So Japan, for example, missed the shift from hardware to software entirely. But if you have a sort of clear plan, which is that we want to get rid of coal and move into solar, then that makes even more sense. But I think, I mean, it's a good question. I have to think about it more.
Thank you, Carl. Ghulam?
Thanks, Chair. I mean, South Africa, Carl, you may know, we are very labor surplus economy. So, I mean, if you have technologies that replace workers, or generally, I mean, with the huge unemployment, that does create problems. However, technology could be introduced in more dangerous occupation. I'm like thinking like mining or deep level mining. Clearly, automation can play a useful role. Or in other, with corporates, if they want to replace or use technology to replace workers, should there be some kind of levy involved? Should they be regulated in particular ways so that the employees or workers that are being replaced, that they get skilled in a particular way? Or is technology going to be introduced in significant ways which are going to exacerbate unemployment? What about a basic income grant being introduced simultaneously? I have questions like those. Thanks.
Thanks, Ghulam. I think those questions were all for Carl.
Yeah, so yeah, first of all, I mean, absolutely right. So many of those jobs that have been automated away have been the most dangerous and hazard ones, and technology has also in itself improved working conditions. So if you look at factories, from the switch to electric lights, it reduced pollution and increased levels of oxygen in factories, and the workers were allowed to choose between electricity and gas lights. All choose electricity. So clearly technology has played an enormous role in that, and that improving working conditions in general, and that has been a very positive story. I mean, I'm totally open to basic income. I just don't believe in universal basic income, which is received by everybody. I don't see why you would, somebody at the very high end of the income distribution needs a basic income. So I'd be more in favor of something closer to sort of Milton Friedman's proposal of a negative income tax. With regard to reskilling and retraining, labor market institutions in many countries are very different. So in Sweden, for example, the unions have played a very significant role in negotiating with the Confederation of Industry and introducing what's called, I'm struggling to translate it, but basically sort of structural transformation agreements that provide retraining opportunities for people in sectors that are being downsized. Obviously, in the United States, where unions are very weak, that is not feasible. So you will have to look for other ways of dealing with that. And I think when it comes to retraining, the hard part is always that local labor market conditions differ a lot across locations. So often when something works in one place and then you scale it up to very different conditions somewhere else, it doesn't work that well. So I think that's something more for sort of local labor market policy.
Thanks, Carl. I see Laurie W. Not sure who that is.
So I'm Laurie. I work for the CCM, and thank you for a really interesting presentation so far from everybody. And this one is for Prof. Toit, and it's linked to what Kathy said earlier on about the just transition. I thought that was really interesting, and I was just wondering if that whole just transition isn't what they were thinking of with the National Minimum Wage Act, when they expanded the jurisdiction to go beyond employees and to the broader definition of worker. Because as part of that, for example, there's if you work for fewer than 4 hours, you must be paid 4 hours for at least 4 hours work, shall I say. in terms of the National Minimum Wage Act linked to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. But it almost seems to me that that's could be what the legislators here are thinking of, is that needing to protect this broader group as that broader group is growing in our economy. I'll just be interested to hear Prof. Toit's view, or anybody's, in fact. Thanks.
Darcy?
Well, actually, I was also wanting to respond to Kathy's point, and hopefully this will take up Laurie's point as well. And that is, well, I'm not an environmental lawyer. My daughter happens to be one, so I've got some exposure to it, but I don't know enough to speak with any authority. But I do think that the notion of just transitions is also a very useful one from a legal framework, precisely in order to engage with these problem areas in a more holistic way, and not try and not go for fixing individual problems, but seeing them systemically and coming up with holistic legal responses. Now, in some ways, we've got the building blocks in labour law already, in things like protection against unfair dismissal, which is there to potentially, at least when people are being threatened with automation, and but then again, the way the law is framed now, the employer will almost always be able to justify replacing people with machines, because it's from a business perspective, it can be a rational decision. So one needs to take that principle further in this new environment in order to make it work better. And this might help to address the questions which I think earlier in Carl's presentation came up, namely, should there be limits on the numbers of jobs that can be replaced by automation? Well, if there are to be limits, then that would require a legal formula. But such a formula can't be sucked from anyone's thumb. It would need to form part of a thought-out structure of a structural approach. And so too with skills development. I mean, that's another thing that exists. It doesn't work very well in practice. There's a system in South Africa which should work, but I don't think it works very well. Maybe better in some sectors than in others. In other countries like Germany, I believe it does work much better when it comes to retraining workers who are faced with redundancy. But in all these fields, it comes down to political will again, because there needs to be the same urgency for implementing these measures as there is, for example, when it comes to tax collection. Until we are as serious about skills development and managing just transitions as we are about tax collection, we probably will not be making much difference. And the ideas are there already. It's a question of giving them regulatory shape. But I think that is, if you like, a very mundane question that should get a lot more attention. How can one generate the political will? That is a scientific question. How does one change the present climate of lip service being paid to good ideas and then business as usual after this pandemic? We've all been told a new normal, but I think what is happening in countries like New Zealand and elsewhere, despite the election result there, is that for most businesses, it's a question of how can we get back to the old normal as quickly and cheaply as possible. So that is I think the real question without which nothing else will happen.
Thanks, Darcy. Ruth Castle-Brankel.
Thanks so much for two very interesting presentations. I had two questions, one for Carl and one for Darcy. So for Carl, I mean, I would be interested, I understand your reticence to UBI, and I myself have am ambivalent about it. But in a context of widespread informality, where people haven't necessarily had jobs, are not necessarily enrolled in informal tax systems, to what extent do you think these measures, whether it's wage insurance or tax credits, can really apply? I mean, most of the African continent has rates of informality of 70, 80%. And is that perhaps, going back to Eddie's remark, a difference between the global north or global south? Yeah. And then the second one is to Darcy. I was interested in thinking a little bit more about this relationship around the labor protections for migrant workers. And what are the possibilities of delinking the right to labor protections from immigration status, even if it doesn't necessarily mean the opening up of borders, but at least that even undocumented workers would be assured that they would have all of the labor protections afforded in the law, and that the instruments of administration de-link those two factors. Thanks.
Thank you.
So that's really good questions. I mean, there may well be situations where UBI is more practical. I mean, in general, I tend to think that substituting the welfare state for UBI is a bad trade. But if there's sort of, for political feasibility reasons, you can't build a welfare state, then UBI may be a way around that. So I'm not objecting to that, but given the choice, I would definitely prefer something like a sort of negative income tax, or sort of traditional welfare state.
Darcy?
Thank you, Ruth. A good question. I don't think it can be uncoupled entirely from immigration. The good news is that migrant workers do have labor rights. Once they are working for an employer, then even if the contract is unlawful, it is still employment. The law's position is that the employer may be liable under immigration law for having employed somebody that the employer was not entitled to employ. So the employer had to pay a fine, whatever the case may be, but the worker is not deprived of protection for that reason. And so there have been cases in the labor court of an undocumented migrant, an Argentinian as it happens, whose right to not be unfairly dismissed was upheld by the labor court. The difference being that then that worker can't be reinstated because the being employed was unlawful. So I believe he got compensation and paid instead, but his right not to be unfairly dismissed was protected. And so too to workers who are performing unlawful work, the famous case of a sex worker who also was protected against unfair dismissal, even though the work that she was performing was unlawful. And as importantly, the Constitutional Court has in two cases upheld the rights of migrant workers to social security rights, but those were migrants who had permanent resident status. So, but unlawful migrant workers or undocumented migrant workers still, in other words, have a certain level of protection, because the law cannot possibly take the view that because they are undocumented, therefore employers can do with them as they please. But why it can't be uncoupled from immigration law, I think, is simply that for an undocumented migrant worker to stand up and enforce their rights means that once they have won in the CCMA or in the Labour Court and they've received their compensation, it will be the duty of the Department of Home Affairs to deport them because they are here in breach of immigration law, and that's what the Act says. So ultimately, one will need to address that problem, and and I personally think it will mean opening the borders in much the same way that the European Union has done.
Thank you, Darcy. I don't see any other questions, and we have been at this for some time. Let me just say that I'm really pleased that the conversation has turned in this discussion on issues of public policy, on the impact that digitalization would have on our society. And that's what we need to be discussing, how the law should be responding, how we should be responding through the political process, what new policies may be required, and so forth, to have a just transition. So let me join with Kathy's observation that that's really what the conversation should be about. I want to thank Carl and Darcy for their time and for their wonderful presentations, which gave us all food for thought. Thank you all very much. I think we can bring this conversation to an end, at least for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Feroz.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I thought that worked really well.
Yes.
Yeah. In
Right.
fact, it would have been nice to continue it, actually.
Yes. I think there's it kind of, yeah, very rich. Do we have another seminar?
No, but I think we should think about one, Eddie. I'm going to apply my mind and email you, but maybe not this year, maybe in January. Or late November we could work for, right?
Do we have a topic?